Leader David Seymour's end-of-life choice bill would allow people with a terminal illness the option of assisted dying. Mr Seymour told Parliament the current law doesn't work, and it's time Parliament did something about it.
It is wrong that in 2017, under the laws made by this House, we tolerate a status quo where people suffer needlessly. We allow, under our laws, violent amateur suicide, barbaric suffering and informal euthanasia, all perfectly legal. But the choice that we don't allow is the person in question who is suffering at the end of their life to make a choice, make their choice safeguarded under the rule of law. The current situation is an absurdity.
But Nationals leader Bill English rallied against, saying it would remove a principle at the core of the law, the blanket prohibition of taking the life of another.
We have to weigh up in our role as lawmakers, not just as parents or children or siblings or friends of those who we've seen die, but as lawmakers. And our role is not principally to alleviate suffering. Our role is to ensure that our society has a set of laws that protect those who most need protection.
But Labour's Lewis Wall cited the case of the Wellington woman Lucretia Seals, who fought and lost a legal case to die on her own terms.
My support for this end-of-life choice bill is based on the judgment by Justice Collins, and he highlighted the status quo is not ideal and that people were at risk of intolerable suffering and of ending their lives earlier than they would otherwise. He put this kaupapa back to Parliament, and it said it was for Parliament to address these issues. Parliament makes the law and the courts interpret the law only, and that's actually a principle of our democracy.
Earlier in the day, Mr Seymour had struck a deal with Winston Peters, promising to support an amendment for there to be a public referendum on the issue in return for New Zealand First's 9 votes. New Zealand First's Tracy Martin explained why that is important to her party.
I look around me, Mr Speaker, and I see farmers and accountants and lawyers and debt collectors and teachers and journalists, social workers and religious leaders. Not a single one of us is smarter than the people who placed us here. Not a single one of us has more of a conscience or less of a conscience than the people who voted us here. This issue should go to them.
But Nationals Nuk Korako opposed the bill, saying euthanasia is foreign to Māori.
To me, assisted dying is to fast forward a process that ultimately denies our loved one the chance to be taken to their ancestral home and are instead left in limbo on their own in a transitional afterlife until their time finally arrives. Let the dead be the dead and the living be the living.
Nationals Maggie Barry warned the bill would leave the elderly vulnerable to abuse.
This bill will enable more people to predate on the vulnerable, with far too few, negligible even, protections and safeguards.
76 MPs voted in favour of the bill and 44 against. Select committee hearings will begin early next year. From Parliament for Morning Report, Benedict Collins.
David Seymour is the MP who sponsored the end-of-life choice bill. The ACT Party leaders in our Wellington studio. Kia ora, Mr Seymour.
Good morning.
Can you talk me through this binding referendum? It's your promise to pass that amendment or add that amendment to the legislation that got the bill to Select Committee. Is that your view?
Well, the bill would have got to Select Committee even if New Zealand First had voted against it.
So why did you... Because you don't want a referendum, do you?
Look, I think it's quite possible to pass a law without having a referendum. That's an addition that New Zealand First would like to have, and that's given us 9 votes in a much more comfortable margin. But the commitment is that I will support an amendment to the bill that would add a referendum so it only becomes a law after a public vote. Whether or not there will be enough support in Parliament for that amendment to be added to the bill actually depends on the rest of the House. I've got 1 vote, New Zealand First have 9, you need another 50-odd to pass an amendment.
And you think that might sway people towards it if they think that the public's going to have that say in the end?
Look, it might well sway some members of Parliament who are a little bit worried about what they're voting for to be able to say, well, actually, you know, there's a final say from the public. I'm also quite confident that if we were to have a referendum, it would pass into law because New Zealanders overwhelmingly and consistently tell reputable polling companies, including those used by RNZ, that they support this law, usually by a ratio of 75 to 25.
Further than that, is it advisable to pass legislation of this type without a referendum?
Look, every piece of legislation in the history of our country going back to the 1850s has been passed without referendum. So
This
we know
is
that
a
it doesn't.
particular and a particularly contentious type of legislation, is it not?
Yeah, and look, people have said that about quite a number of pieces of legislation through history. I don't want to say that this is not deeply serious, but I would add that it's becoming normal around the world. 20 years ago, when it was first debated in New Zealand, no other jurisdiction had passed such legislation. Now it's Belgium, the Netherlands, Bolivia, several US states, Oregon, Washington, Vermont, California, Colorado, the entire country of Canada, and recently our cousins across the ditch in Victoria. So there's now a lot of jurisdictions who have done this. It's becoming normal around the world because people can see that it's possible to design a law that gives choice to those who want it and protection for those who want nothing to do with it.
What do you say to Bill English's definition? It's an exemption from the criminal law of killing.
Well, in a strict technical sense, he's correct. And it has been found, most recently by our own High Court in Lucretia Seal's case, prior to that by the Supreme Court of Canada in Carter versus Canada, that it is possible to design such an exemption in law such that people can be perfectly well protected, but also those who are suffering at the end of their life can have some choice and control.
People doubt that. As Maggie Barry puts it, it's a license to kill. And people doubt that there will be any protection from the kind of social pressure that will ensue as a result of this legislation.
Yeah, and I mean, look, people have to make up their own mind between who is more credible. A unanimous verdict of the 9 justices of the Supreme Court of Canada who looked at all of the evidence from all of the jurisdictions with these laws exhaustively, or Maggie Barry, who has some other motivations on this issue.
You're suggesting it's a mainly religiously fuelled opposition to the legislation? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I do think it's curious that every single member of Parliament who spoke last night against the bill is somebody who is known to have deeply held religious convictions. And I respect that, absolutely. But it's curious that not one of them mentioned it. And I think the challenge for people who come from that perspective is that we all respect each other's spirituality and each other's faith, but the quid pro quo on that is that you have to respect other people's choice.
Finally, does a qualifying medical condition, which has to be either under your legislation, either terminal or grievous and untreatable, include mental illness?
No, it doesn't. There's another clause in the bill that says that the person must be of sound mind. They must understand the nature of assisted dying and the decision that they're making. Someone with depression, for instance, by definition, has a very warped view of the value of life and would be disqualified under that clause. And come to that, they would not have qualified in the first place because it's not a grievous, irremediable, irreversible condition.
Appreciate your time. David Seymour, MP, ACT MP, the sponsor of the End of Life Choice Bill, going to Select Committee. It's 20 minutes past 7 on Morning Report.
The government says it will consider moves to rein in